Before the Bakke case was decided, Jewish organizations were debating. Affirmative action, good for us, bad for us, which side should we come out on? And Jewish nonprofit groups, community groups filed briefs on both sides in Bakke and have continued to do so in all the cases. So none of this is new. And I'm willing to accept, in many ways, Asian Americans are analogous. They occupy a similar position to American Jews 50, 60 years ago. So here's what's interesting. At the time that Harvard and these other institutions had anti-Semitic quotas, caps, they did not have affirmative action. They weren't helping African Americans. They had hardly any African Americans to speak of. This was just plain, regular discrimination, straightforward. No one would have called it reverse discrimination because there was no such thing, all right? So the causal factor, here's what's important about this. The causal factor for the Jewish quotas back then was not that administrators at these schools said, we need more African American students, let's admit fewer Jewish students. No, it was just administrators at the school said, some openly, we're going to be overrun with Jewish students if we don't do something about this, so let's admit not quite as many. We'll admit some, we won't keep them out altogether, but we just won't admit them in the numbers that they would deserve to be admitted in. So that's a great way to think about this, because historically, this type of discrimination is unrelated to affirmative action. Now, to the case. So what's happened here is you've got two cases, and they've been mixed together. Okay? People ask me all the time, well, which side are you on? Are you for Asian Americans or affirmative action? My answer is both. Let me also be clear about something. I'm sympathetic to Asian American parents and students who want to go to elite schools. I was once an Asian American student, no different. And I'm sympathetic to and respect and actually admire Asian American parents and students who organize and agitate, who stand up and speak out, and who are not willing to let people push them around. More power to them. The problem is, though, if you identify the wrong cause and the wrong villain and then end up pursuing a remedy that won't fix the problem, but might actually make it worse. So here are the two cases. One case is, does Harvard and do other schools in some way discriminate against Asian Americans? Okay. And that's actually a factual question that you can assess. Look at the evidence. That's what I think is most important. Not my opinion, not my say-so, not anyone else's opinion, not anyone else's say-so, but what is the actual evidence? And I'll talk about that in a moment. The other case, though, is about inclusion, diversity, affirmative action, whether it's constitutional, how it should be practiced. Those cases are not necessarily the same, but they've been jumbled together. Just as Professor Takagi showed, what has happened is when Asian Americans have said, we face bias, college administrators say, oh, we just have to limit you because we're trying to help African Americans. Think about that. That's a non sequitur. It doesn't make any sense that you would have to disadvantage Asian Americans in order to help African Americans. This is just a way to come with an excuse, right? Because when Jewish students were facing quotas in the 50s, it would have been nonsensical to say to the Jewish parents and students, oh, well, we can't admit so many of you, we have to admit some African Americans. No, it was just prejudice and just discrimination. From what I've seen, I'm fully prepared to believe, but I want to see the evidence, that it's entirely possible Harvard or whatever other school you want to substitute is or has been discriminating against Asian Americans. It's entirely possible. Vis-a-vis whites. Because when you look at the average test scores, there's a secret hidden out in the open, which is, in many of these instances, so this is also true with Lowell High School, you might remember that case from about 20 years ago, Asian American students, specifically at Lowell, Chinese American students, had to score higher than whites in order to get in. So it had nothing to do with African Americans and Latinos. That was just a red herring, just an excuse. Asian Americans were facing discrimination relative to the baseline of whites, or the majority, When we look at the absolute raw numbers, that's where the real fight is. The number of African Americans and Hispanics isn't great enough to really matter when you consider how many Asian Americans and how many white students are applying and want these coveted seats. So the Harvard case is all about statistics. Nobody has said, not even the plaintiffs, that there's a smoking gun. This is not a case where they're saying some Harvard administrator wrote a memo that says let's cap Asian Americans. Instead, what they're doing is analyzing, if you take a look at how many Asian Americans apply, take the grades and test scores, and if you run a lot of different regressions, you look at it every way that could possibly cut it, the proportion being admitted isn't what you would expect. And you might say, well, shouldn't this be easy to determine? It's not so easy because there are all sorts of compounding factors, and I'm not here to defend Harvard. Much of what's come out about admissions is unseemly, I'll be honest with you. It's sort of embarrassing to lead institutions. Those of us who have been in a position leading institutions are aware of this. Admissions is not an art, nor is it a science. Admissions is just a hodgepodge of politics and everything else mixed together. So when you look at how Harvard admits people, there's stuff unrelated to Asian Americans, unrelated to African Americans that you might scratch your head about, but that everyone does. And alumni preferences are among them. So legacies constitute a huge proportion of the Harvard class, as they do for every private institution. And when you look at alumni preferences, it is a preference. The children of people who went there, or grandchildren, and sometimes many generations back, are favored. They are admitted at a significantly higher rate with lower credentials than the applicant pool as a whole. So part of the question is, what do you do about a group such as this? Alumni children, do you include them in the statistics? Do you not include them? Here's the crazy aspect of this. And there's so much in all of this that's a little crazy. There's now pressure to eliminate alumni preferences, which are usually justified for fundraising or for the notion of building a sense of community. Right? The school belongs to you as you belong to it because your grandfather donated the money to build the dorm that bears your family name. The crazy aspect of this is alumni preferences might be abolished just as Asian Americans are in a position to benefit from them, as well as African Americans and other people of color who now are represented as they weren't before. So here's what's happened with this case. And the most important part of this, technically, is when you look at the mismatch between the plaintiff's complaint, their causes of action, and their prayer for, what they want for relief, what remedy they ask for. I'll explain. And you can get this online. And don't take my word for it. Look at this for yourself. One of the things I want to make sure I do, no matter how persuasive I am, I'm not here to persuade you to see the world as I see it. I'm here to provoke you to think for yourselves. To think about these issues in a new way that's not literally, nor is it figuratively black and white. So take a look at the complaint the plaintiff's filed. Here's what's fascinating about the complaint. The whole front part of the complaint says, Asian Americans face discrimination. Then the last page, that's the prayer for relief, that's where the plaintiffs ask for what they want from the court, says, therefore, abolish affirmative action. So let me be clear about this. The whole front part of the complaint and the opening statement, the evidence that's come in from the plaintiff so far, shows that Asian Americans face discrimination vis-a-vis whites. But then the back part says, therefore, let's harm African Americans. Right? That doesn't make sense, right? That if Asian Americans face discrimination, then the remedy should be stop discriminating against Asian Americans relative to whites. It doesn't have to be, let's shut down all programs that seek for a modicum of diversity and some inclusion of African Americans, Latinos, and others. Right? A few final points, and we'll open this up for discussion. There are people who actually argue whites should have affirmative action. In the New York Times, on its op-ed page before Bakke, there was a white author who wrote in and said, white ethnics face more discrimination and are less well represented than Orientals, who are doing really well in higher education. Therefore, it's white people who should have affirmative action, not Asian Americans. And Asian Americans historically have been very much included. The greatest irony of this case is the people agitating against consideration of race might be the people who could benefit from it. Which is to say, not just in other contexts, government contracting, breaking through the glass ceiling, but even in higher education admissions, those who have a compelling story to tell about how they were racially isolated, bullied, teased, and taunted, as Asian Americans so often are, the one and only family in the entire neighborhood. Asian Americans historically have been included in these programs, and when you look at the virtual absence of Asian Americans, so the late Chang Lin-tin was the first Asian American chancellor to head a research university in the United States when he led UC Berkeley more than a generation ago. The number of Asian Americans in higher education leadership positions is a fraction of what you would expect it to be. Asian American women are tenured at absurdly low rates. There are studies that suggest Asian Americans are promoted to management at lower levels than anyone else demographically, including other people of color, including white women, in Silicon Valley, in tech, in an area where they're thought to be overrepresented. So, far from arguing for the abolition of the consideration of race, perhaps the people who are most concerned about this should insist that Asian Americans be considered. There are various other concerns we might have, such as part of the Asian American community appropriating for itself the entire label by not disaggregating data, because there are many Asian ethnic subgroups that demographically look much more like blacks than they do like whites. And I make no claim to be representative. I'm not here speaking for every Asian American. Nobody could do that. There's a diversity of opinion among Asian Americans. But it worries me that when you look at the statistics, aggregation of Asian American favors certain Asian ethnic groups over other Asian ethnic groups that are severely underrepresented. The last aspect of this is that there is an oddity to this entire case, as if the greatest civil rights concern, in a time when our citizenship is being challenged, but the greatest concern that any of us in this room might have is, will I go to Harvard? Now, no disrespect to Harvard alumni or to any of you who want to go to Harvard, but there are a lot of other issues in the world, and there are a lot of other programs, there are a lot of ways in which Asian Americans can work with African Americans and others, and this obsessiveness with Harvard as the defining civil rights issue for Asian Americans makes me just wonder if perhaps the emphasis on brand and prestige, the Tiger Mothers and all that, hasn't in some way contributed to this problem itself. So, let me conclude with a thought, and then we'll open this up for questions. I welcome every type of question. My thought is simply this. You know, it's great that Asian Americans are now included. It's fantastic that people talk about Asian Americans. You know, I get calls from reporters all the time who ask me about Asian Americans. And I was talking to someone 2 days ago, and he said, you know, you've been talking a long time. I feel like you're, you know, just giving me all this history about Asian Americans. I want to say, I am doing that because you know nothing about Asian Americans. And I wasn't that rude. But Asian Americans haven't been in this picture. It's great that we're in the picture now. I wonder if there's a way for us to be in the picture positively rather than negatively, as bridge builders who can see a little bit of both worlds, both sides, who can help us make good on ideals that we share in this diverse democracy, rather than as pawns, as spoilers, as those who would be held up by others who haven't worked with Asian Americans in the past, but who have an agenda